The infant's cries carried faintly through the thin walls, muffled and uneven, before vanishing into silence. A neighbor later recalled hearing them once, twice, then nothing more. The home where those sounds had come from was ordinary enough, a narrow townhouse on a cramped London street, but what happened inside was anything but ordinary. It was a place where mothers left their babies in desperation, handing them over with small sums of money and the belief that someone would care for them. Instead, it became a place of death. The women who ran it advertised themselves as caretakers, calling themselves nurses or mothers for hire. In truth, they were something else entirely: baby farmers, part of a grim trade that thrived in the shadows of the 19th century. The practice of baby farming began as a service that seemed to fill a desperate need. Across England and later in Australia, unmarried mothers, widows, and women too poor to raise a child alone faced shame and economic ruin if they kept their babies. Adoption was rare and poorly regulated. Into this gap stepped women who offered to take children for a fee, sometimes promising permanent adoption, other times claiming they would provide long-term care until the mother could reclaim her child. On paper, it looked like charity. In reality, it was often fraud, and in the worst cases, murder. Among the most notorious of them was Amelia Dyer of England. She presented herself as a matronly figure, often responding to newspaper ads from young women in distress or placing ads of her own. Married couple, with no family, would adopt child, small premium required. Mothers would bring infants to her home, sometimes tucking a photograph or letter in with the baby's clothes. They believed the child would have a chance at a better life. Instead, Amelia Dyer pocketed the money and ensured the child would never be heard from again. Early in her career, she quietly allowed babies to starve, their deaths hidden under the veil of illness. But as suspicion mounted, she turned to swifter methods. By the 1890s, she was killing infants within days of receiving them, strangling them with white dressmaking tape. It was her signature, later discovered in multiple cases when small bodies were pulled from the River Thames, wrapped in packages, still bound with that same tape. The horror of Dyer's crimes shocked the nation. Investigators linked her to the deaths of dozens of infants, though the true number may have been in the hundreds. She had operated for decades, slipping through cracks in the system. Midwives, doctors, and neighbors had raised suspicions, but the stigma surrounding unwed motherhood kept many cases hidden, and law enforcement struggled to prosecute without clear evidence. When Dyer was finally arrested in 1896, police discovered piles of baby clothes, adoption paperwork, and letters from desperate mothers begging for updates about their children. The scale of her operation became undeniable, and her trial riveted the public. She was convicted and hanged at Newgate Prison, but the baby farming trade did not end with her death. In Australia, similar scandals surfaced. Margaret Waters, originally from England, became infamous in London before baby farming practices spread to the colonies. In Melbourne, the name that struck fear was Frances Lydia Alice Knorr. Known as the baby farmer of Brunswick, Knorr's crimes emerged in the early 1890s when multiple infant bodies were discovered buried in the yards of rented houses. She had moved frequently, leaving behind shallow graves when she could no longer afford rent. Knorr had worked in various roles as a domestic servant and sometimes a midwife, but soon turned to baby farming for income. Like Dyer, she lured mothers with promises of care and adoption, only to kill the infants once she had been paid. At her trial, neighbors testified about the foul odors, the hurried digging, and the unexplained cries followed by sudden silence. She was convicted of murdering one child, but suspected of many more. In 1894, she was executed by hanging, her case sparking outrage across Victoria. Other women followed similar paths. Minnie Dean in New Zealand became the only woman ever executed in that country when authorities uncovered the bodies of infants she had drowned or suffocated after being entrusted to her care. Her case, like Dyer's and Knorr's, revealed the disturbing ease with which women could collect children and vanish them without oversight. Mothers who surrendered their babies rarely came forward after suspecting something was wrong. They feared public shame, exposure, or criminal charges themselves. That silence created cover for women who profited from death. What made the baby farming murders particularly chilling was not only the number of victims, but the betrayal at their core. These crimes preyed on society's most vulnerable, impoverished women and their children. Mothers paid what little they had, often believing they were sparing their babies from starvation or the workhouse. Instead, the children were killed for convenience, their short lives erased before they could begin. And in many cases, the mothers never knew the truth. They might have received a letter claiming the child had been adopted by a good family, or that the infant had fallen ill and died. Without bodies, without graves, and without legal recourse, the mothers had no answers. Public outrage grew as these cases came to light. Newspapers ran sensational headlines about the baby killers, exposing the grim details to a horrified readership. Trials were packed, not only with reporters, but with ordinary citizens who wanted to see justice done. The outcry forced governments to act. In England, reforms tightened the regulation of adoption and childcare arrangements. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1897 was passed partly in response to Amelia Dyer's case, requiring anyone who cared for multiple infants for payment to be registered and inspected. In Australia and New Zealand, similar laws followed, aimed at closing the loopholes that had allowed baby farmers to operate unchecked. But the legacy of mistrust lingered. The idea that a mother could hand over her baby in hope and instead deliver it to a killer haunted communities for years. Looking back, what remains most disturbing is how long the system allowed it to continue. Baby farmers operated openly for decades, shielded by societal shame and bureaucratic neglect. Hundreds of infants were killed before authorities acted decisively. Even after the laws changed, suspicion hung over any private childcare arrangement. The tragedies underscored how poverty, secrecy, and desperation could be exploited in the most grotesque way possible. The story of the baby farmer murders is not one of isolated madness. It is the story of a hidden economy that thrived in the shadows of respectability, where infants were commodities and vulnerable women were silenced by fear. The faces of the perpetrators, Amelia Dyer in England, Frances Knorr in Australia, Minnie Dean in New Zealand, became infamous, but they represented a wider system that had failed to protect the innocent. For every body discovered, there were likely many more never found, their short lives erased by women who saw them as obstacles rather than children. Even now, more than a century later, the details chill the imagination. The muffled cries, the quiet exchanges of money, the small bodies wrapped, hidden, discarded. Mothers left waiting for letters that never came. A society forced to reckon too late with the depth of the betrayal. The baby farmer murders were not just crimes of greed. They were crimes that exposed the darkest failures of a world that looked away when women and children most needed protection. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.